Welcome to a new series by Tales and Tactics. This is our inaugural Tales of Lore, where we dive deep into the stories that shape the world and our favorite games. I'm your host, Max, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Troy, and working behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. I'm going to attempt to explain what this series is about, or this episode type. Like, I don't want it to sound finite, because we really keep talking about stuff, but I got the idea from any of the times we've introduced games, and I feel like I'm not getting enough out of the lore of the thing. There's so many facts that I learn about a setting or something like that and its references. Most of what we want to do is talk about how the game, like in our rules as written and beyond the book, we're talking about game concepts. But the fiction of a game world or a genre that exists in gaming, because some games are more generic and they fit more into a broader concept, is this idea of lore and the world that the game lives in. So I wanted to do more of that justice by having its own episode where we dig into it. Now, people may be aware that on the internet, there are whole channels dedicated to just doing this. So the thing that we want to bring to this is not just a conversation about lore and storytelling and how that might tie into games in certain ways, but also the publicational history. I think this also comes from the fact that I enjoy reading books and I like the stories and the concepts, and I see how those threads find their way into other stuff. So to kick this one off and to kind of set the mold apart from like, we're going to talk about Battletech or Warhammer or Star Trek or any of these things, which we will probably end up talking about those things as settings in other episodes. And we may even drill down into very specific topics within those settings or even where other ones cross. The first one is going to be titled The Golden Age of Fantasy, which is when the precursors of fantasy became popular and the whole thing became mainstream, which is around about the 1970s. So the wild frontier of fantastical literature kind of hit its heat, right? I'm not saying this is where it began. I'm saying this is, in recent memory, this is the peak of fantasy literature. And all of the forms it took and everything that came out of that we now look at today as more conventionalized fantasy. So yeah, Troy, what is your experience in the fantasy genre and maybe roughly around this time period concept?
I am a big fantasy head. I grew up on The Hobbit as my initial introduction to the genre. And then it was something that I was really interested in to the point that I was reading anything in the library that was fantasy, even if it was a very questionable quality. So I've read a lot of bad paperback fantasy when I was a kid. I think the Tolkien stuff stuck with me, as we'll come to discuss the mythic fantasy. That was really what resonated the most with me. I do have fun with concepts of high fantasy and these like arcane settings. I think they're really fun, but I am drawn to something that's a little more grounded in its relatability, even if it is driven by broader strokes and higher ideals.
And again, this kind of comes more into that modern form that comes out of the 70s. But we will get into the precursorative genres that feed into this.
Now, what I wanted to do was turn this around, and I wanted to hit you with the same very question. What would be the fantasy of your introduction, and where did you come from? Like, let's both establish our backgrounds to give better context.
I'd say that the first fantasy story or stories that I was read as a child was The Hobbit and The Last Unicorn. And those are very much in that mythic fantasy thing, like that style of writing. Though The Hobbit is, and to some extent, The Last Unicorn are children's stories. Also, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Oh, good reference.
So this is like early childhood stuff. And again, I tend to lump those into the mythic fantasy. This is more of the, I don't want to call it fairy tales because that sounds derivative or broken down. But it lives in a space next door to that concept. And it's these more large movement, plot-driven stories that have some characters in them that are obviously interesting characters. And in very often those more modern books, the characters definitely come alive, right? As opposed to in a fairy tale, you don't really know that much about the characters except that they represent the subjects of the plot.
Yes, exactly.
But there is a through line between those two things. And then in adolescence, I got into reading Conan a lot, and Bran McMorn and Solomon Kane. Basically, I just started reading Howard.
Okay, right on.
And I was also getting into science fiction as well at the same time, which we can get into when we talk about science fiction. Science fiction is interesting because its supposed golden age, which is a bit harder to define because it doesn't have this sharp peak, is some years earlier to this. It would have been probably in the 50s, where a lot of this stuff was still sort of formulating or starting to come up to a rise. Some people might argue that it's even earlier than that. Some people argue that the best science fiction comes later. And I think science fiction gave me a lot of grounding for how I looked at those things because my tastes were further away from, like, it took me a really long time to really read Lord of the Rings.
Oh, okay.
And I only really ever had a strong experience reading The Fellowship.
Yeah, I get that.
I guess I kind of bounced off it a little bit later, like as you went through it. Like I'll say that I read 3/4 of Fellowship.
Oh, okay.
Before not reading it. And then later kind of coming back and sort of finishing it. I like Tolkien's writing style, but not in terms of plot movement.
I've really enjoyed Lord of the Rings, but it's almost like you don't enjoy it for the velocity of the plot or the dynamism of the way the story is told. It's more in the use of the language and the environmental characteristics that he can bring forward. It's interesting because it contrasts with the mythic fantasy in that you have these super high ideals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of like, well, of like light versus dark, of the right of kings, these big notions. But then it really spends a lot of time on like what the blades of grass look like. There's not really an even point of balance between those two concepts in a lot of Tolkien's writing. And it's almost like if you don't find one of those two things really grabs you or that distance repels you, it's harder to get deeper into the writing.
Yeah. The thing that I think sort of sets what we are calling mythic fantasy is probably more initially founded by Lord Dunsany, who wrote The King of Elfland's Daughter, which is really, a lot of his writing is, I could best described as very inspired by the tone and grammar of the Bible.
Oh, okay.
For lack of a better word. It's more poetic, but it also has this sort of like, this is happening, but it feels like it's not happening now. Like the idea of time. And I think for something where he's talking about, fairies and elves and stuff like that, that sort of weird fairy time feeling kind of comes off of it. It's whimsical. Sometimes it's quite sad, but I think what he's coming off of, which I think is, I guess, the root of a lot of this stuff, is romantic literature. So I don't know if you've ever read like Frankenstein.
No, I have not.
Mary Shelley. Okay, so there are very clear sections of that I call the romantic literature sections, where the protagonist is just describing the drama of the landscape, and you're like, what? Why is this happening? Why are we just going down a boat down a river and I'm talking about how, like, the majesty and terror of the mountains.
Right.
And it's nice, but to a modern reader, it seems a little bit out of place. And that's because it's a big part of the theme, because it's about, controlling nature and how that's folly and all that, because it's a very romantic literature thing. And I find that Tolkien gets some of that in his work.
Yes.
Not so much the themes of romanticism, so much as the interest in the here and now, but then that kind of almost conflicts with the mythical highness of what's happening. So he has that boots on the ground, spilt ale and laughing and singing, literally with songs with lyrics. And it has this almost folk tradition thing going on inside it. And at the same time, it has this Dunsany-esque mythical fantasy operating on above that we know that we will engage with. And however you like your writing style, or whatever you think of Tolkien, you may think that he transitions between those really well or not so well.
I find that the key is like, you have to love the poetics of Tolkien and the way he uses the language and that kind of more romantic focus on the environment.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be really attached to that because that's going to make up the majority of the content of the word count, relative to the higher concepts that are really motivating and really interesting. And that can be the real grist of a mythic fantasy story. But it is kind of the other stuff that makes up the majority of the book or books. So it would be kind of tough to really get into an author like Tolkien if you didn't like the way that he fundamentally spends his time talking about the experience of being in a place or having a dinner or something like that. You know what I mean? Because there's so much of that.
And it's interesting to compare them to, so you have mythic fiction and that as one of these precursors. And then you've got the other stream, which is sword and sorcery. And so this is where you get your Howard and your Liber. And I guess their earlier precursor is Edgar Rice Burroughs. So with things like Tarzan. Oh, and like C.L. Moore, and it's gritty adventures. I almost say that it's not fair to call it like a journalistic style because it is quite poetic. In fact, Howard, I believe, sort of at least initially wanted to be a poet, and kind of like the way that Tolkien likes to put little songs in his stories. Sometimes those Conan stories are prefaced with a poem. Sometimes it's his, sometimes it's someone else's. Usually it's his, though. And then you immediately get into this very like pulse pumping, plot driven action where Conan isn't superhuman. In fact, in the first story, he nearly gets killed by some kind of shadow monster. But the idea is that he is a formidable person and that it very much focuses around him as an individual. And I think that's the thing that Sword and Sorcery nails out that mythic fantasy doesn't, is that the individual is key. Even with Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, even though it's not one of them, it's two people, but they're individuals playing off of each other. Part of the fun of that, aside from the fact that it reads a little bit smoother than Howard does, it's more modern, is the banter and the camaraderie between the characters that is fun to read. But again, that's more of that individual. It's these two characters playing off of each other. And there's some of that kind of happens in Tolkien, for example, but it's not the same sort of tone about it.
No, it's way more like people say things because it's important to make the statement, less than it's a conversational exchange between two peers, right? Like Legolas and Gimli get into that. The Hobbits have that. Strider has that, but not really Aragorn or Elisar by any estimation. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like his context. But I think it's because characters have a lot to do with class and role in Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Which changes their the way that they're almost permitted to behave. Like, Sam's allowed to be way more open about his emotions and feelings because he's the commoner of the group. You know what I mean? Like, so he has there's a different, from the way that it was written in the perspective of the author from the time he came from, that kind of is baked in, and it kind of changes some of the interactions that Sword and Sorcery doesn't carry that with it.
The idea of these monumental things is not really a part of what is called Sword and Sorcery, or what is classified as being within that. If anything, it's the self-motivation and almost mundane quality of the adventure, though again, it can be quite perilous to the individual that it concerns. It doesn't really come up to the level that, like, the world is in danger. I mean, there might be some implication of that, but it's not the hero's concern. Whereas in mythic fantasy, that's almost the whole point.
There is some great peril of a fashion, and it is of a moral like spiritual but also material concern, and then like how do you deal with it? And yeah.
Well, and it's the scale of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's almost a matter of perspective if you're going to compare them. I mean, it's not a fair absolute comparison. Like for instance, in the Chronicles of Narnia, it is very much taken from the children's point of view in any one of those stories, some more than others. But it feels as if the direction that that's being taken is more about fulfilling these greater roles.
Yeah.
And the fact that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are friends, you can see something like a conversation happening there.
Yeah, for sure.
The other thing is the length of these things. So Sword and Sorcery is a form of pulp literature, and are short stories that were paid out by the word. There's a certain kind of quick finality about it, and you really want to like cut to the chase. You would not be afforded the luxury of setting the tone with a lot of flowery language if what the reader is hoping to get is that frenetic action based thing. So these are some of the early forms that I guess what we would think of as fantasy now takes. Then there's this third heat that isn't really those two main ones, but is definitely important to talk about, which is weird fiction. And it's funny because using Howard wrote for Weird Tales. So there's a direct influence, but I wouldn't say what Howard writes most of the time is weird fiction. Maybe for the time it would be, but I'm talking more about, well, the most obvious of these is Lovecraft.
Of course.
As important as Lovecraft is to the conversation of weird fiction, probably the most key to this. When it comes to weird fiction fantasy, I actually think Clark Ashton Smith is a much more prominent character because he actually writes these fantastic Hyperborean tales.
Yes.
That are these almost surreal riddles that feel like a pulp story. They're really fun to read, but you're really like, where is this going?
Yeah.
What are you getting at? And I mean, to be fair, like for someone that wrote pulp, he's very obtuse, and some of that's actually quite refreshing. And sometimes you're like, what are you doing?
Yeah, exactly.
But that in itself becomes like memorable. And it's interesting how like sometimes the mantle of these things gets taken up by other authors. I know that Robert Bloch wrote a lot of like Lovecraftian stuff before writing things like Psycho.
Just a quick question. Does Jack Vance count as weird fiction?
I would say so. And again, also having a huge influence on the fantasy genre not because things like The Dying Earth are fantasy stories, because in a lot of ways they're not, but it's the weirdness about how you can't differentiate one thing from another as being fantasy or science fiction that kind of makes it fantasy by default.
Okay.
Obviously, like Jack Vance is most known for, obviously the Dying Earth series, which is where we get the Vancian magic system, obviously. It's a factoid that has been pointed out to death, and certainly no problem with that. It is worth reading Vance. Vance is such a weird author to read. I sometimes find it a little bit of a chore for a few reasons. He has this very straight ahead style that I don't want to say is impenetrable, but he kind of hand waves some decision making, but there's these little clever moments that fit in there. So it's refreshing, but I don't know. It doesn't read in the most modern way. I've read some of his like more pure science fiction. It's very, it's very 50s sci-fi.
Right.
You know, the scientific principles it's more like gadgetry.
Oh, okay.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Not always. There's a series, I've forgotten what it's called actually, but it's about a guy that crashes down on a planet that is thought to be deserted, and then it's got all these different alien, I guess it's something like a Princess of Mars, but with a bit more of a sci-fi-ish, like traditional sci-fi edge. The idea is that none of the people on this planet are spacefaring.
Oh.
But the guy who crashes is.
Oh, cool.
So it almost comes across as a fantasy world, but he doesn't spend that much time digging into that aspect of it. It is more plot movement based. Again, it is kind of pulpy. But yeah, he's definitely fits into that weird thing. But me mentioning that story brings up this thing that is so common, that is actually the thing that I think Tolkien kind of broke the habit of when we get into the proper 70s era of fantasy, which is doing away with what I call the fantastical conceit.
Oh, okay, yes.
So the fantastical conceit is, it could take two forms. In modern parlance, it's strange that this has existed well before this, but the Japanese term isekai is this idea,
Yes.
which is the character that we are relating to must come from our reality, or the world must originate from our reality. So the first one is obvious. It's a princess of Mars, which is I don't even get into how weird that transition is, but guy from our time period or from some time period in our reality is either, or for one reason or another, is immediately transported to another world. Could be nearby, like in Princess of Mars, it's Mars. And it turns out that is a totally different place than anyone here would have thought. But it could be another dimension, another timeline, an alternate reality. So that's one element of the fantastical conceit. And the other one is what I think of as more the Conan route, where it is taking place in a past that has been long forgotten and maybe misremembered in our own time. But the whole point of this is to give familiarity to the reader while giving total creative license to the author.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be the reason for doing this. I think when you read the older stuff, it's kind of, it's fine when you're reading it. It feels well woven in. And then as you get closer to the 70s, whenever that conceit is brought up, it's really awkward. I read, what's that author? John Norman's Gore series, the first novel, Tarnsman of Gore. Its sexual politics are maybe the thing that's controversial, but just reading it on its face, it's about some Gary Stu character that gets abducted by some kind of spaceship to a sort of parallel Earth on the opposite side of the sun, where it's this kind of Hyperborean Conan fantasy world, and he meets his estranged father there. And it's just, the whole setup to that book is too much.
That's too weird.
It just feels like a writer with weird daddy issues. And then you get into the actual plot where they're learning to fly these giant birds, and it's almost like aerial dogfighting. And that part's cool. And some of the notions about the alternate world's class system are kind of neat. But the whole thing is that it's this ham-fisted, I want this character to go to this world, but I want him to be established in our world. It's so clumsily thrown together. And I think the author in later books just abandons that idea entirely. But that's how bad that idea gets, right? And that is quite literally the Princess of Mars. Like, that's the Barsoom, like, I'm going to travel to the other world and do the heroic thing.
It's basically like the underscoring of so much of anime and manga as well. You find that there's a lot of these where there's like a digital world that's created, and then a character from our world goes into it. So it is both of the isekai conceits, in that it is both a world extrapolated from our own, and that it was made by people from our world, but it's a person who's also taken from our world and thrown in there. Tai from Digimon being like my favorite reference.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, that's constantly moving between these two realities.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's another good one. Or Kagome from Inuyasha is another one. There's like literally 100,000 references you could make. And some of them are better than others. Like, some have a lot of interest to them, but I find that I don't want that in my fantasy story. I want it to be like a lens into another place and time. I don't like it when it's related to our world unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And you can even say that Tolkien is that type with the forgotten time. You could even say that applies to his writing, because I've heard that argument made, but I don't necessarily believe that. And I am more of the opinion that a fantasy story can be its best when it is not like doing, I don't know, Star-Lord or something.
The one refreshing thing about Tolkien, for sure, is that he's writing a concrete story where things are happening, even though there is this mythical pretense, that it's set in its own world with its own rules without any need to explain. Like, even Chronicles of Narnia has the real world conceit in it, because obviously Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, that's what the wardrobe is.
Yes.
Right? It's a portal that the characters use to go and visit the world. And in other stories, it's so weird because in like some of the later Narnia books, he just does away with this concept entirely. And this happens with Edgar Rice Burroughs and the Barsoom books. It's just like he just wills himself to the other planet.
Right.
And it becomes a bit of a labored concept at that point. Then we get into the Furtive Ground, which is the 1970s fantasy boom. Basically, this is when mainstream fantasy, and this extends into the 80s to some degree, but it really gets started there. And some people have said it's part of the countercultural reaction in the 60s and a wish to escape Cold War anxiety, like some kind of escapism. There's a lot of New Age mysticism, and that definitely shows up in a lot of books. And if not literally, then at least in the tone of those stories. I guess the idea is that people really needed an escape by that point, the baby boomer generation particularly, who are partly the creators of, but definitely the consumers of this. And then obviously going into Generation X, and they would be entirely consumers at this point. There's also an explosion in paperback books.
Right.
The industry that was the pulps died out, and it was replaced with the paperback novel. And these are partly innovations of technology. So the use of cheap paper was one method by which literature was getting put out there more inexpensively. And then the innovation of cheaper binding then allowed for paperback books. So this is where you get your like glue binding and things like that. Obviously, these things existed before this, but now you can mass produce these things. And there's more of a demand for full-length stories. The Double Ace novels, I don't know if you know those ones. They're like 2 books that are like in one.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Those are cool. But like Ace as a publisher being a thing, there's a boom in bookstores as well. It sort of coincides with and kind of presets to like the shift toward comic book stores as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It hasn't quite started at the point this does. It comes a little later, but like you're seeing these revolutions in distribution that totally change how media is consumed. And the variety of titles goes like way the hell up there. Some of my favorite authors from this era are like Michael Moorcock. So like the Eternal Champion series, especially Elric of Melniboné, which like I've read like way too much of religiously, just because it's this weird mixture of it takes. So this is why I use that as a really good example, because it takes this idea of mythic fantasy, these big things happening, but it puts it in the sort of sword and sorcery boots. Elric is a character bound by fate to have this sort of terrible end about him. But the way that the book handles his day-to-day decision making is very much in a pulp style. So it's like, it feels like he feels like an individual, but he also feels like he has no control over what happens. And that would sound like a bad thing, but it's actually really interesting. Elric is also an inversion of Conan, or at least one analysis has him be that. I don't know if Moorcock, he may have. He's pretty explicit on the record for doing things, but the idea that Elric starts with his kingdom, he's like not strong, he's frail, albino, kind of dejected in his society. He already has his beloved wife, and he has a rivalry with his cousin. And then it's basically, rather than Conan, which is building up to him becoming king, it's an unraveling of the king back to being a guy that, well, I won't ruin the ending, but it's a total unraveling. I'll put it that way.
That's really cool. That's very interesting. And this also is just one of the Eternal Champion series, right?
Yeah, and some of them verge into like another one that I've started to kind of get into is, and this is weird because this is not at all what we think of as fantasy, but it has fantastical elements, is the Jerry Cornelius series, which is, he is also an Eternal Champion, but set in a post-apocalyptic 60s world.
Oh, what?
Yeah, and it's got like science fictional elements, and it's more of a theme piece on the misanthropic aspect of modernity. What is it? Carl Edward Wagner, so the Kane sort of series that then starts bringing like horror into fantasy in a bit of a way. You've got Chronicles of Amber. It brings in dimension hopping, which sort of like as a thing, because there's these two realities, and you could say that's sort of like the isekai thing, or like, you know, you were saying with Inuyasha and Digimon, the hopping back and forth between worlds, rather than it being kind of like the whole idea of the initial fantastical conceit is to just get us this character into this place and the rest of it is sort of forgotten. Those sorts of stories play against each other. Another popular theme is this sort of law versus chaos, which would obviously have shown up in the Eternal Champion series, especially Elric makes, you know, he's the champion of chaos, but also resistant to it.
It's kind of like a period of antiheroes in many regards.
Yeah. Well, and it's a big melting pot, more than anything, because what we think of as sort of the typical fantasy antihero plot starts here and kind of worms its way out. Also, another really interesting aspect is that though Tolkien's work was written in Lord of the Rings was written between 1954 and 1955, or thereabout. He's probably writing it well before that, but like the publishing dates came out at that point. It didn't really come into vogue until at least the end of the 60s.
And that had a little bit to do with the counterculture movement of the 60s and their alignment with sort of some of the naturalistic views that Tolkien expressed.
Yeah, so it maps onto things like the hippie culture and the back to the land movement, especially a lot of that sort of meat and potatoes writing.
Yeah, 100%.
Apparently it was a very popular read for the soldiers in Vietnam.
Interesting.
The last place they wanted to be in their mind was in the Vietnamese jungle. So a mythical, pastoral Europe fantasy would be about as far away from their present situation. Yeah, that kind of comes across in a lot of different ways from authors later on as well.
But there were other authors that followed Tolkien, more so starting in the 70s. I guess, would that be Terry Brooks?
Yeah, so that's the sort of, Shannara, which is argued to be a really, really... it was immediately criticized as being basically a Tolkien ripoff.
Okay.
The best thing I've heard about it is that it's competently written, at least, like, you can read it. But, like, you know, you were saying, like, the sort of derivative fantasy that you may have been reading as a kid.
Yeah,
it kind of comes off of that. Like, if I showed you the cover of this book, you would be like, oh, yeah, of course. Because, like, every fantasy novel after this seems to, like, even imitate, like, the cover structure. Yeah, no, go look that up.
I'm looking it up. I want to see this.
It's striking in the form that it sets. It has this idea of, like, you know, the mythical structures. There's a bit more of that grittiness is starting to work its way in from, if not directly from the pulps, then from the contemporaries that are taking up that mantle. There's also the weird fantasy comes in, but it comes back in this more acid-minded, psychedelic quality.
Yes.
And that's really present in things like Moorcock. And then that then trickles down into, like, later in the 80s, the other authors, you see there's these certain avenues of fantasy, like there's a British brutal fantasy. Some of the stories, though these are often more science fiction themed, a lot of 2000 AD stories seem to steal a lot of Moorcock's themes, if not plots. But as I said, that, based on the title of the magazine, is more of a sci-fi thing. There's also a lot of weird things happening in, like, French popular literature. So French science fiction is arguably a kind of fantasy.
Right.
Or a better way to put it is the distinction isn't so clear.
And that would include stuff like Valyrian and things.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you're and going into things like Metal Hellon when it for comics.
Yeah, for sure.
And then that becomes heavy metal later in reprint. We're talking about this spillage, but there's this huge collision. And as I said, sci-fi gets sucked into this as well, where like even science fictional stories, like our distinction of hard and soft SF really like gets hammered out. Because soft SF or even further from soft SF is science fantasy, which is almost a rebranding of things like Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon.
Yeah, it's like a post-Lucas version of defining that.
I'd almost call that a little bit more soft SF because there is some leaning into the idea that there's a consistency with these things. I'm thinking of like hard light bridges and stuff like that. Like that's
okay.
Force fields and things. Yeah, when you get to full blown, what I would say science fantasy, obviously the titular example is Star Wars.
Yeah.
Right? Where the science part now becomes the conceit. And it's more about the mythical traditions. And in fact, I would argue that while it has a bit of that sword and sorcery angle to it, it's much more of a mythical fantasy, right? It's got this good versus evil. It even has intangible energy forces in the universe that represent these things that the characters are then embodiments of.
And they have destinies beyond their own reckoning that they must fulfill, right?
Yeah, it's really Arthurian, all of that. Like, so yeah, Arthurian is sort of the high point or the higher origin of mythical fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, in games, well, Dungeons and Dragons is the obvious outcome. And because we started our initial podcast with the origins of Dungeons and Dragons, it only seemed fitting that this episode and series would fit into that camp as well.
Yes.
And I really recommend people look into some of this older stuff. I find if you go a little bit further back, the writing style becomes a little bit like Tolkien has obviously a very particular writing style that if you're into, you're going to like it.
Yep.
I'd actually argue that's also true of Howard too. It's hard to describe exactly how he writes, and there's different eras of Howard. So early Howard is way more poetic and has more of this sort of ambiguity, classicalness. And then middle Howard is, I got to get it out on time, is what it feels like. He tends to recycle a lot of the same plots. Side characters, especially female characters, don't seem that well developed, and they seem more as a goal than a person. And, these are the sort of shorthands. And then I'm kind of a fan of late Howard because, I don't know how to describe it. It's not that the plots are necessarily better, but he's so refined as a writer that, like, action scenes are amazing to read in late Howard. Like, the clunkiness that you might get from some of the earlier stuff is gone. And it's like, he's almost like he's weaving the poetry and the action in together.
That's cool.
But they're all worth a read. I even enjoy the middle stuff if you can kind of like, think about it as work made on a deadline. And so, yeah, there's these interesting ideas. So, yeah, like in other things in games, our alignment system arguably comes from Paul Anderson. So people cite 3 hearts and 3 lions, and that would be relatively in this area of things. It's a little bit earlier. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to look that up just to be 100%. I don't want to lie to anybody.
The Appendix N it's got some real gems in there. And I mean, it's right at the end of this period in 1979. That's like when you get this, right? So it's almost like a way to summarize a lot of what just happened. Look at this list. This will give you, at least in the context of our gaming history that we're sort of predominantly focused on, as opposed to just literary history, where these influences are coalescing. And like, it can be, like we were saying, a magic system or an alignment system, but it also has a lot to do with like, what is the games we play even about in terms of like the verbs they give you and the actions they expect of you?
True. And I think a lot of good game design acknowledges those things. Like, as we were saying, there are Lord of the Rings games that, like, especially in well-made role-playing games, just feel different from like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, 100%.
And intentionally, like, because they're grabbing onto that thematic element. So yeah, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions is 1961. So obviously it's about a decade out of the gap.
Right.
But it's coming closer to that. And I think this makes the point that, like, it's not like this just all happened at once. It was this culminating of things that kind of brought it together with a culture that was ready to accept it, right? So there's a lot of rediscovery in a golden age.
Well, with anything in history, it's never the first time, and it's always messy. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Those rules apply to like almost every concept in history. So, yeah, I don't know. I find what really is intriguing too is what happens immediately following the 70s. Is you start to move into like the 80s and like the legacy of this stuff.
Yeah, then you get I guess what's the long shadow of high fantasy.
Yes, exactly.
I argue that along with the existing genres either still happening or in some sense being pastiche, you end up with two popularized versions that come out of this. So one of them I'm going to call heroic fantasy, and the other one I'm going to call grimdark fantasy.
Okay.
That should sound fairly familiar to a lot of people. So I'll go with heroic fantasy. So heroic fantasy is leaning more into the mythical sense, but the characters feel more superhero-ish. Like maybe not quite literally, but the way they're viewed. So this is things like the Dragonlance series.
That would have been some of what I read as a kid.
Those books aren't necessarily bad,
no.
But it is a certain sort of fantasy where the characters feel much larger than life. It's almost like it's trying to split the difference between having these epic things that are happening and also having larger than life characters. Whereas in Tolkien, the destiny seems to overtake anybody's personal position.
The Strider has personality, and then he loses it as he becomes more kingly, sort of.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that as a criticism per se, but just as a way that character's arc progresses, as he assumes the identity of the archetype.
Yeah, and when you get into what I call heroic fantasy, I want to say like the most crude version of this is like He-Man.
Yes, okay.
Right? Like Masters of the Universe is really like on point for this because every character feels distinct and special and larger than life, and they're doing larger than life things. The one downside to it is that often the things that aren't within that peer view kind of fall to the edges. And some author, like as I said, there are some Dragonlance novels I remember that where like there is mind paid to what else is going on in the world, but then there's other ones where I don't feel that was the focus, and that is likely not the point, right? You're not reading heroic fantasy because you want to know about the ordinary class system that might be going on.
Yeah.
You want to see powerful, beautiful people throwing swords and casting spells.
Yeah, like a group of heroes who are on the right side of their quest, trying to do justice or something that seems obviously morally clear. And there's a villain who's done like irredeemable villainy, you know, in some fantastical way, like, oh, I've reached into the forbidden spells, you know? And then there's like some dramatic arc that pays that all off, right? And it's like, that's your heroic fantasy module. Dragonlance even had like stuff, as far as I understand, like based on literal adventures.
It started as something that was imagined to be it was originally a product for Dungeons and Dragons, which I think clunkily forced you to play certain characters in a certain way, and then they rewrote it as novels, and it works better as a novel because they took away a lot of player agency.
Yeah.
Even though the story was good, it didn't quite what is it? There's that Vecna module where you play as the great wizards, you know, like Bigby and Mordenkainen, and it's like, well, we're all going to get killed and we don't have a choice. And it's almost like historical recreationism, but in fantasy.
Yes. Interesting.
The plot is set and like, why is this a game? And I do think that at least between being a game initially and being a set of novels, Dragonlance works better as a set of novels. And then from that works better as a setting.
Yeah.
Again, the problem with heroic fantasy, and you may have found this in playing any Star Wars role-playing game, is that you either get swept up in the plot of what's happening in the middle of the world, or you totally ignore it.
When if you're trying to role play in a heroic fantasy setting, you kind of need to like create your own little pocket that you can do your own little heroic arc in. You know what I mean? Like or you replace the main characters with your characters in a very like Dark Forces style, right? Where you're like, I'm actually the main character, and then you just have them fight Darth Vader.
Yeah, I always found that to be a little weird, though, because it's like, I know that's what's going on, and I don't feel like I'm really telling my own story.
Agreed.
Again, I'm somebody that likes procedural storytelling as opposed to rote storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say you can't have a good time doing that, but I can always see what's happening, and it takes me out of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So then also, again, I don't know, I'm pressed for time. We still have a bit. I'd like to cover Grimdark, which is sort of the shadow of heroic fantasy.
Yes.
Where nobody's special and everybody's going to die, and it's more of a horror game.
Yeah, it's like that horror shadow is really over the fantasy label in the grimdark fantasy genre, if you want to call it that. And yeah, it has way more like pessimistic, brutal stuff to it. It's more the home of the anti-hero. You know what I mean?
It is embracing that way closer, for sure. To go to another game system that is also a world, we'd have to talk about Warhammer Fantasy.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You know, as being kind of the brooding thing looking across the table at Dragonlance.
Yeah, exactly right.
Again, it comes off of that. It's way closer. It's more European, for starters. So it's more steeped in things like class and intrigue around class. Like it's buried more in its own history rather than references to pulp stories.
Yep.
A more sort of mythicalized version of fantasy. It's obviously borrowing way more from Moorcock. Moorcock didn't come up with the idea of the powers of chaos, because that's more of a Paul Anderson thing. But the type of chaos present in Warhammer is Moorcockian chaos.
Well, it's funny, like there are the trappings of Tolkienisms over Warhammer, but that's not really what they're doing. Yeah.
In some cases, I feel that this is a byproduct of the origins of Games Workshop in and of itself. So I often, people want to try to explain Warhammer 40K to people, and they're like, well, why does it have orcs and what are basically elves but in space? And it's like, because that's what they had at, they were a miniature, they sold another company's miniatures for Dungeons and Dragons, and when they wanted to play a space game, they had this sitting around. Well, the same thing is true of Warhammer Fantasy, which was they were selling Dungeons and Dragons and miniatures related thereof, and they were also selling a lot of Tolkien miniatures as well. So what they had sitting around was Tolkien stuff. But the stories they told, they were not that. I mean, in some ways, if you can almost imagine it like there was no Fellowship of the Ring, and it's just a matter of time before, chaos envelops the world. But here's what I think is most interesting. The most popular series from within that world is Godric and Felix, which is arguably heroic fantasy in a grimdark setting.
Yeah.
It seems less obvious in the first book, or in the first couple books, but then as you get into it, it's like, are these guys even killable?
Yeah, right. That's true. I mean, that's one of the things about grimdark fantasy is like, it kills characters, right? And those guys don't.
It's hard to invest in someone you know is going to die, fair enough. But it's also hard to invest in someone you know is going to win.
Yes.
Right? So this is always the trick.
It is.
Part of the reason why I like games sometimes over stories is because I know it's going to be one of these things. It's either going to be a comedy or a tragedy in the classical sense. Doesn't mean it's actually funny, but in the sense that the character is going to either win and everyone's going to be happy and good, or they're going to die and everyone's going to be miserable.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting when you try to cross those things into each other. And as I said, I'm trying to bring this back to games, right? So there's other sorts of things, I could rant a lot about the origins and workings or not workings of the Forgotten Realms.
Right. Okay. Because you got Forgotten Realms, which is a big example. What are some of the other really big names from that time that captured that heroic or high fantasy nature?
Wheel of Time is an interesting one.
Right.
I don't quite know where that sits, because it can be very real and in a grim kind of way. It might be one of those settings that sort of splits the difference.
Yeah.
And which is probably why it's popular, because it's very nuanced. The books, I haven't, they made a show out of it?
Yes, I've heard that.
I practically ignored this. Yeah, I haven't seen it. I've heard mixed things. But the bit of the books that I've read, I think I just didn't like the style of writing, but I did like the characters, and I liked so maybe I'll try it again. I think that seems fair. Also, a more modern, popular Grimdark is Game of Thrones.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Or, a Song of Fire and Ice,
yeah.
I suppose, if you're talking about the books. That one, I think, has taken it too far.
Yeah.
Not in the sake that it doesn't necessarily mean... So I hold to the theory that what's-his-name has written himself into a corner because he refuses to have anyone be the hero, but he wants the story to conclude, and he can't square that circle. J.R.R. Martin.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because he's somebody that sort of like sets a premise. Like I enjoyed reading some of his wild card books, which are basically if superheroes were not in novel form.
Oh, cool.
It's based on a role-playing game, actually.
That's interesting.
I don't remember what game it is. Someone can tell me if someone knows what the Wildcard series role-playing game, not the one that was made of it, but the one that it comes from, is based on. I'd actually really like to know that. I liked that one, but that he had set a premise that was more like, oh, well, what if superhero heroic fantasy, but was written more in a prose style rather than a comic book. And he stuck to that, like, completely. And I sort of got from that when I was reading some of Game of Thrones or Song of Fire and Ice, I got that he was doing that. And I guess that's his thing. It's like, I'm going to commit to this idea. And it's like, oh, it's got to be like history and nobody's going to win or no one's going to be the good guy. Maybe is a better way to put it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think he has ridden the wheels off this thing. And that's why he's not writing. I could be wrong. There could be totally other reasons. He may just have too much money and not care.
Another one that's interesting that's more modern is Steve Erickson, who's like grimdark and weird fiction. Because his setting is so bizarre with like just everything about it, like the flying beetles and all the crazy stuff, the way magic works and the seeing the gods all the time and just everything about it, man. It's got the weird fiction to it, but it's also quite dark. Sometimes it revels in being dark in a way that's kind of pushing the envelope for the sake of it, but it still maintains its integrity as a narrative and is still a really strong series. Gardens of the New Moon or something is the name of the series, but it's the Steven Erickson 13 or so book fantasy series. And that's a good mix of the weird fantasy coming back into this era again because of all the strangity that kind of underscores that series.
It's interesting, like, as I said, like these things get pushed together and then squeezed out in another form. Like China Medieval is kind of like that, where it's almost like taking science fictional fantasy, but then now bringing weird fiction as being the prominent thing. So, Perdido Street Station, The Scar, Iron Council, like those books are fantasy tinged in the way that they choose not to explain things. And that's another thing, which is like a writing style thing where I'll be reading his books and then I'll be like, oh yeah, this is really cool. And then suddenly I'll run into some description or some way he phrases something and I'm just like, and I put it down. So style is a whole other thing separate from like the content of it. But yeah, so like effectively though there are people who write in pure fantasy, the gates have been blown off their hinges at this point. Yeah. So any final thoughts before we dip out on this experiment?
I'm a huge fan of the fantasy's expression of thoughts and feelings as like tangible things, you know, like, are you afraid of death? Well, here's a zombie. You know what I mean? Like, I love those things.
Right.
And it's really cool that the different genres of fantasy throughout time have experimented with the ways in which they express things and what it is that's their point of expression itself.
Mm-hmm.
I still find mythic fantasy is like what hits me the hardest, but I've read Howard and I've always enjoyed that kind of like That, like, the sound of steel leaving the scabbard that he captures so well.
Yes.
There's nothing like that. And when you go to Tolkien, it's like you want something that's like meant to evoke a history and a feeling and this certain nature. But these other more pulpy stories actually like have a sense of action and impact that you will not find in Tolkien. So it's I don't know. Have a broad appetite is the best thing you can do.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's with anything. Sometimes I'll just pick something up because I think it's interesting. I might follow like an author, but that'll lead me into, if it's an adventurous author, then it's going to lead you into other things and you might consider reading something else.
Yeah, true.
So, yeah. But yeah, my conclusion about the 70s as being this, and I quote unquote, golden age, which is not a fair thing. It might be more accurate to call it a prism where this faint light of fantasticalness hits it and then fractures into all of these much more vibrant but different streams. And it can be gritty and it can be uplifting and it can be both of those things.
Do you want to give a little preface of what we're going to do next that's kind of perhaps out of the norm?
We got a couple things coming up. We do have another kind of episode type. And this is one that is sort of, I want to do this more often, and this will require audience participation, which is part of the thing, is what we are going to call the Do-It-Yourself series. And that sounds small scale, but really, we want to hear about your games that you are making out there. And we were actually sent one by one so bold as to put their work up front, which is good. You should all be doing that. And just because you send us something that you're doing, we're not going to debase you if we don't think it's great. We'll definitely tell you what we think. If we don't think it's quite there, we'll keep that just between us and we'll give you our criticism. But I think for the most part, we'll have something good to say and we'll have some criticism and we'll just kind of take it as it is. But if it's playable, we will make an episode out of it. And some part of it could just be we might accumulate just a bunch of house rules and go through those. There's a lot of different ways we could do this.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have a game coming up. And sorry, what was the game again?
Fight of Fantasy.
And so we got an episode dedicated to that. And also, I finally found a rule book for Games Workshop's Dark Future.
Oh, right on.
That'll be the other one. And then we'll have some other fun conversations tossed in between those.
Exactly.
Until then, hope you enjoyed the episode. It was a weird and scattered experience.
Yeah, give us your thoughts. Throw some comments at us. We'll be happy to reply and, start a conversation. And otherwise, I don't know. Thanks so much for listening on this experiment, like Max said.
Yeah. And happy gaming and reading.
Happy gaming and reading.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.